I've been stationed at Badlands National Park for several years now. It's a good job most days. The incident I'm writing about took place last summer in mid-July, during one of those hot, near-desert-like days when the thermometer was pushing over 100. Badlands is quite an interesting place. It's a kind of wild, stark beauty carved out of the land. But then it's also this quasi-moon surface in some areas, full of rugged rock formations, sharp cliffs, and jagged spires. Working as a park ranger is an enriching experience. You get to see a different side of the world. It's quiet. It's serene. It's beautiful. There's something about the isolation that puts things into perspective and helps remind you why you signed up for this duty. But it's not always exciting. There's a lot of paperwork, liaising with tourists, and maintenance work to keep the trails and viewing areas in decent condition. And every so often, we get some fool who thinks it's funny to chuck a soda can off into the wilderness or start carving their name into our trees and rock. But you've got to love the job because there's no replacement for those breathtaking sunsets or the sight of wildlife in their element. I was on my usual rounds that day, checking the trails, making sure the trail signage was intact, observing if the animals were behaving normally, and unfortunately, also picking up the occasional litter left behind. I was on the Sage Creek Loop, a good third of the way through, on the rise that gives you that really fabulous view across to the rock formations on the other side of the creek. It was approaching evening, and the critters were starting to hunker down for the night. And then I heard something. It was a strange sound, out of the ordinary. The best I can describe it was a low, guttural grunt, accompanied by a sort of knocking noise. The direction of the noise was more or less clear. It seemed to be coming from off to the west, down past the base of the hill. But what it was, well, that I couldn't pinpoint. But being out in the field, you learn not to jump at every sound. Things in nature can be unpredictable, and there's often a logical explanation for anything odd. So I decided to continue picking up some trash. Strange sounds or not, I still had work to do. Then I heard it again, but louder this time and more insistent. It was a deep, resonant growl, contrasting eerily against the peaceful silence of the park. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. At this point, I decided to shelve my cleanup task and investigate further. As I made my way down that slope, every sense of mine was on high alert, watching for any sign of movement or another sound to point me in the direction. But the world around me had gone strangely silent. Suddenly, I noticed a pattern in the silence. The animals were anxious, nervous even. They knew something was off. I saw unusual tracks on the ground. There appeared to be large footprints embedded deep into the earth, almost human but bigger, much bigger, and barefoot. I followed the tracks deeper into the wilderness. It was then I saw it. My heart froze as I took in the colossal figure standing tall and ominous, just a few feet away from me. It was massive, standing easily at about 9 feet, and adorned with dark brown, almost reddish hair that covered the majority of its powerful body. The creature had a pronounced forehead, wide nostrils, and a face that was a mixture of man and ape. Its features resembled those of a primate, but there was a human-like intelligence behind its eyes. They were deep-set and dark brown, almost impossible to see in the fading light. There was something about its face, scarred and weather-beaten, that told of its years in the wilderness. Before I could react, it produced this deafening roar, sending birds flying away from nearby trees. The sheer power of that sound was stunning, echoing throughout the deserted wilderness. The smell of the beast was equally shocking. It was a musty, pungent, putrid odor that seemed to clog my nostrils. With my heart pounding hard in my chest, I backtracked slowly, my eyes never straying from the ape-like creature. The silence of the forest was broken yet again by the creature's deep growl. It watched me as I slowly retreated, its deep-set eyes never leaving me until I was out of its sight. When I reached the trail again, alone but safe, I began to question my sanity. Was it possible? Had I indeed come face to face with the fabled Sasquatch? I reported the incident to my colleagues, but it was dismissed as a result of working alone in the wild in harsh conditions. They said my mind was just playing tricks on me in the changing light of dusk. However, the encounter had a deep impact on my life. Each rustle in the brush still arouses fear. Every unknown noise in the wild feels like a signal of impending danger. I'm no longer the same ranger who found solace in the isolation and serenity of the wilderness. Now, there's a lingering sense of fear, a tinge of uneasiness as I patrol the same trails. And I can't help but feel that sometimes those deep-set eyes are still watching me from the shadows. Whatever creature I encountered that evening, it was a stark reminder of the unexplored and untamed wilderness that lies beyond our understanding. It was early spring in Chugach State Park when it happened, one of my favorite times of the year. Now, if you aren't familiar with Chugach, well, it's an Alaskan chunk of wilderness all its own. Mountains break the skyline, endless forests run thick and dense, hiding all kinds of wildlife within, not to mention the pristine lakes that mirror the vast expanse of the Alaskan sky. It's harsh but undeniably beautiful, one of my favorite places in the world to be. I remember that day well. I've been a park ranger here for about a decade, but nothing in all those silent, solitary patrols ever prepared me for it. See, being a park ranger at Chugach isn't just a job. This park lived in my blood. It was the reason I woke up in the morning. Every day, it was my responsibility to ensure the safety of its visitors, and an honor to preserve the pristine nature of the park. My routine activities included patrolling the trails, trying to reduce wildlife encounters with park visitors, and responding to occasional visitor queries. That day, everything was business as usual. However, as the sun started setting, I noticed something odd. It had been a calm evening. The forest was silent except for the distant rustle of leaves in the wind and the occasional call of a bird. I was headed back toward the station after having completed my last patrol of the day. I drove along the dirt road, my truck's headlights cutting through the twilight, when I noticed a figure at the edge of the light darting quickly across the path. It moved too quickly for me to get a good look, but it was unusually large, bigger than a bear but not lumbering like one. It seemed to glide silently across the ground. I continued driving along the trail, my heart pounding, adrenaline spiking as my mind raced. Hours later, back at the station, I was still puzzled over what I had seen. I'm used to the wildlife around here. I've encountered bears, moose, lynx, and even wolves. But whatever this was, it was different. It moved with a swiftness and agility I've never seen before, like it barely disturbed the earth beneath its feet. The logical part of me reasoned that it must have been a known animal, maybe a moose running off. Yet, there was a nagging feeling in me that it wasn't something so mundane. Earlier in the day, I'd received a radio call from a group of anxious hikers, claiming to smell something decaying near a popular trail. This was always a concern in bear country. If there was a carcass nearby, we had to close the trails immediately for the safety of the park visitors. But that wasn't all. They said they could hear eerie laughter carried on the wind, like someone or something was watching them. At the time, I had dismissed it as nerves from city folks not used to the strange noises in the wild. There were no signs of a carcass when I went to investigate, so I moved on. Now, thinking back, I wondered if it could be connected. It wasn't until dusk had completely fallen, and the last specks of light had vanished when I heard it. An animal's howl, eerie, echoing through the cold mountain air. Nothing unusual, except there was a human-like quality to it. A bone-chilling mockery, like laughter almost, accompanied the howl. Then, the lights at the station began to flicker. The scent of decay and earthiness wafted through the open window, stronger now. I shut the window and locked it quickly, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. I decided it was time to call it a night, slid the bolt across the door, and prepared for bed. But sleep was a long time coming, and I was left alone with the strange, unsettling events of the day. The remainder of the night seemed to last an eternity. Each creak of the building and distant call of wildlife sent my heart racing. It wasn't until the early rays of dawn hit my cabin that I finally managed to drift off to a restless sleep. The following day, I woke with the sunrise and carried on with my duties, but with a heightened sense of alertness. Every odd track, unusual noise, or unexplained scent made me suspect its origin. I was determined to understand what I was dealing with. I needed to ensure the safety of our park goers, and selfishly, myself. I didn't want to be out there with some unidentifiable predator, if there was one. Despite my earlier fears, the majority of the day passed uneventfully. That was until late afternoon, when I received a distress call from a family of campers, alleging that they saw an animal with glowing red eyes that was far larger than any known local creature. Heart pounding and a shiver running down my spine, I made my way to the family's campsite. They were visibly shaken and quickly packed up to leave, leaving me to investigate their claims. Where the family had noticed the figure, there was a distinct musky stench, mingling with the scent of decomposition. The smell was overwhelming, and I had to fight back the urge to gag, knowing there was no natural source I could attribute it to around that area. Eventually, dusk fell onto the Alaskan wilderness. I made my way back towards the station, hoping to leave behind the unsettling events of the day. However, my hopes were in vain. About halfway back, a feeling of dread washed over me. The hairs at the back of my neck stood up as bone-chilling whispers seemed to arise from nowhere. I held my breath, waiting, and then I saw it. Standing at the edge of the trees was a figure shifting and coiling upon itself. It was large, and with an eerie agility, the figure took on the shape of a coyote, but one much too large for reality. Its fur was a shadow. Its eyes were red and glowing in the low light. Before I could reach for my radio, it disappeared, leaving me staring at the empty forest trail. That night, I couldn't deny the truth anymore. I was dealing with a creature of Alaskan native lore. It was a shapeshifter, a skinwalker. In the days that followed, I found it hard to carry out my duties. Now, I didn't only need to worry about the park's conservation, but also about an unknowable entity that seemed to lurk in its heart. I grappled with ideas of alerting authorities or park visitors. But how could I expect to be believed? And if I were, what actions could be taken? After a week of restless nights, unusual sights, and eerie sounds, everything stopped. As if the creature, the skinwalker, had vanished. Things got back to normal, or rather as normal as they could get. Maybe it was just passing through. That's the only explanation that gave me any solace. It's been years since those bizarre days in Chugach State Park. I continue to serve here. My respect for the power and mystery of this land has only deepened. I'm not a man of superstitions, but I can't deny or rationalize what I experienced during that springtime in Alaska. Some things we just can't explain, and maybe we aren't meant to. I've been a ranger at the Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve for the last 18 years. I've seen a lot. I've seen hail in the middle of summer, rattlesnakes slithering about in frigid temperatures, tourists thinking they can climb the dunes in flip-flops. But this was something else. It wasn't something I signed up for. My job is to keep the park safe and preserved for this generation and the ones yet to come. I get to traipse about in the largest sandbox in North America, making sure people and wildlife coexist in harmony, and the ecosystem thrives as Mother Nature intended. On the day in question, it was pretty much business as usual. I had started my rounds early, braving the biting chill of the Colorado morning, and did my best in maintaining the delicate balance of this ecosystem. As the day wore on, the temperature soared. The dunes, unrelenting in their scorching beauty, shimmered under the high noon sun. I kept my eyes peeled for tourists venturing too deep into the park without adequate supplies, or the sporadic trail of litter that wore my nerves more than I care to admit. Just past noon, I found myself on crest duty, checking the conditions of the ridgelines. These dunes can be treacherous, and sudden shifts in weather could lead to potential hazards. My binoculars scoped the landscape, inspecting the telltale patterns of the sand, indicating stability or a recently occurred slip. I had just lowered my binocs, about to move to the next point, when I saw it. Now, I didn't get a clear view. Mind you, the midday sun and glinting sand wouldn't let you see a cactus till you damn near sat on it. Still, there was definitely something unusual in my field of vision. I quickly turned my head, but whatever it was had gone. The sand was untouched, save for patterns etched by the wind. I stood there staring at the serene, deadly beauty of the dunes, with a chill of unfathomable dread snaking down my spine. Who knows, I thought, heat stroke could make a man see things. Maybe I had better get myself some water and sit down for a moment. I moved on, ignoring the prickling sensation of being watched. I couldn't shake that thought that something was out there. Maybe it was nothing more than a trick of the light, a mirage, or so I hoped. Despite the silent assurance of the vast, sun-bleached landscape in front of me, unease hung over me like a vulture circling its dying prey. I continued with my duties, patrolling the immense sandbox we call the Great Sand Dunes National Park. But as the sun plunged towards the horizon, my mind kept drifting back to the unknown creature I saw in the dunes. The dunes were eerily still through my binocs, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Back at the visitor center, as my colleague Earl was leaving his shift, I mentioned the unsettlement troubling me for the last few hours. Earl's been around for nearly as long as I have. He just smiled, acting like the old man that he is, and told me, "John, you've been looking at the sand too long." Before heading home for the day, a feeling urged me to give the dunes one final check. I drove my truck to a more remote part of the park. I was out near a bowl-like depression where the sands formed steep, undulating contours. As I peered through my binoculars, a movement caught my eye. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was an enormous figure. I estimated around 8 feet tall, standing upright on 2 legs. It had dark, rugged scales seeming to blend with the shadows. Its head looked disturbingly reptilian, complete with a pair of piercing yellow eyes that echoed an age-old savagery. My blood went ice cold. Its gaze was focused, searching, predatory even. Despite its distance from me, I could sense its intelligence. I didn't know what to think of this creature. It was both reptilian and oddly humanoid. Was I looking at a dinosaur? Just as I was about to reach for my camera, it abruptly turned and disappeared over a high ridge, swift as a bolt of lightning. In that moment, I realized my very primal human instinct of fight or flight, but I was frozen. In the fading light and confusion, I made a decision. I quickly retreated to my truck. I made it back to the safety of the station, but my mind was a whirlpool of thoughts, questions, and disbelief. I stayed up most of the night, fueled with coffee, flicking through biology and folklore books, and countless web pages of unverified cryptid sightings. Weeks have passed since the encounter, and I still can't explain what I saw. It terrifies me and intrigues me both at the same time. All these years I thought I knew the dunes through and through. I realize now there's a lot more hidden in this vast sandbox, a lot more secrets lurking in the shadows. The only thing I can say for certain is that if you choose to venture into the wild, remember, we are the guests there. This happened a few years ago while I was working as a park ranger at Nickerson State Park. If you've ever been, you'll know it's a pretty idyllic spot, nestled right in the curve of Cape Cod's Arm. Picture postcard stuff. We're talking lovely little kettle ponds, woods thick with pine and oak trees. Just the sort of place you'd think would be calm, serene, and safe. But boy, do I have a tale about a night that was anything but ordinary. As a park ranger, you get to love the park, like it's a part of you almost. You learn every trail, every curve, every hidden spot where the critters like to hide during the hot afternoons. Now, as you may imagine, a decent chunk of my job involved routine tasks. You check trails, mend fences, make sure tourists don't get lost, occasionally break up a rowdy party or two. I'd typically start by checking on the trails, looking for any downed trees or damage that happened overnight. I'd walk those trails so many times I could do it with my eyes closed. On that particular day, everything seemed fine during the day, not a thing out of place. As dusk settled in, I was on my usual rounds, patrolling the campgrounds, reassuring some of the campers who heard something strange in the woods. Usually it turns out to be just a raccoon or possum, or some other creature. Foxes have a scream that sounds like a dying woman. People from the city don't know that, and they can get pretty spooked. I just dealt with a group of teenagers who thought it could be fun to feed the raccoons. After dispersing them, I started towards one of the more isolated loops, furthest from the park entrance. Most nights, it's the most peaceful part of the whole place, with its own little kettle pond. I personally loved it, especially at night, though I get how the isolation could put someone on edge. It was there the incident began. As I was walking, I became aware of a smell that I can only describe as putrid. It was musty like rotting wood, but also curiously acrid, almost sour. It was a thick scent that seemed to hang in the air, heavy and almost, sticky. Instantly, my gut churned. There was definitely something wrong here. I've always trusted my instincts out there in the wilderness. They've kept me safe more times than I can count. The rustling leaves, usually harmonious and comforting, began to sound threatening. A crack of a twig made me jump, though normally I would have dismissed it as a deer or a squirrel traipsing through the underbrush. The night suddenly felt extraordinarily dark, swallowing up the beam of my flashlight as I continued to tread forward, ignoring the sinking feeling in my stomach. Then I heard a noise. It began as a low, guttural grunt, resonating deep into the quiet forest around me. It came from somewhere off the path, but I couldn't find its source. I stood frozen, trying to make sense of what animal out here could produce such a sound. Sound travels strangely in the woods at night. It can make the smallest animal sound like a lumbering bear if it's quiet enough. But there was something about this noise that didn't sit right with me. A shiver curved down my spine, and for the first time in my career, I felt a pang of real fear. I radioed base, but no one was answering, which was strange in and of itself, given there's always someone on hand for emergencies. I knew I was on my own in that moment. Swallowing my fear, I pushed onward, toward the weird, grating sound. Suddenly, the dense atmosphere broke with a sharp, piercing screech. It echoed with a fury I'd never heard before. It was something between a yell and a deep, resonant growl. The raw power of it reverberated through my bones. I felt then I was in danger. It was unlike anything I'd encountered in my years in the woods. There was a quick succession of knocks against a tree nearby. I stepped closer, my hand shaky on the flashlight as I cast its beam into the haunting darkness. And that's when I saw it. 16 years in the park, and never once had I seen or heard anything like it. This creature was massive, almost 9 feet tall if I had to guess. It was hard to make out exactly in the dim lighting, but the outline was clear as day. A hulking figure, broad and muscular, stood against the backdrop of the night sky. The hard slope of a prominent forehead, heavy jaw, jutting chin, and a pair of deep-set eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. And then there was the smell. The unmistakable offensive odor I'd encountered earlier was now stronger. It was inescapable, nauseating. As for the creature itself, I could see hair, lots of it, dark brown, nearing on black. It was matted down in some places and smoother in others. A shiver of realization went down my spine when I saw its ape-like face. My mind raced, grappling with the knowledge that stories I dismissed as myths could be something more. Terrified, but hardly daring to move, I was caught between fear and fascination. But my focus was broken as my radio crackled to life. The raspy voice of my coworker filled the night. Startled, the creature huffed before it turned and disappeared into the brush with a few lengthy strides. I stood petrified with my heart beating out a terrified rhythm against my ribs. Finally, I responded to the radio, trying to calm my voice, and told them I'd be back shortly. But what could I tell them? Who'd believe me? The rest of the night was a blur, or maybe a nightmare, who knows? Making my way back, I reported no unusual incidents, logged out, and returned home. I lay in bed, the haunting image of the creature lingering in my mind. Sleep was a foreign thought. In the days that followed, I continued my rounds, half hoping and half dreading seeing the creature again. But the creature, or what some might call a Sasquatch, never made another appearance. I hoped maybe he was simply passing through, but the fear lingered. Perhaps, I thought, there were dark corners of this beautiful world, unknown and unexplored, that are home to such magnificent yet terrifying creatures. And for all others wandering the wilds, remember, there's more mystery in the world than what meets our eyes. Working as a park ranger in Wind Cave National Park is definitely not for everyone. Just ask those city slicker interns who last about as long as a snowball in the Arizona desert. But for me, I wouldn't trade it for anything. It started as a childhood love for nature and ended up being a commitment to keeping the wilderness preserved and protected. The fresh pine air, the jeweled stars on clear nights, even the challenging winter months, they all make it worthwhile to be out here. But I didn't write in to wax poetry about the joys of being a park ranger. No, I have a tale to tell, and it's quite a wild one. It all happened during a routine day at the park. For us rangers, the routine varies day by day. One day, we're out maintaining trails. The next, we are checking campgrounds or making sure our visitors aren't jumping the gorges. But that day was different. It was more of a gut feeling, you know the kind. No proof, but you just know something is off about the situation. Well, you might say my morning went by like a breeze that day. Early patrol of the trails, a light breakfast of coffee and a bagel sandwich, and a casual exchange of banter with some campers. Everything was normal and totally uneventful. By noon, I'd finished my rounds, picked up a few leftover beer cans the campers had so generously donated to the wilderness, and started heading back. There's this one trail. We call it the Ranger's Trudge because it's our own little shortcut towards the main office. It winds through the dense woods and tall trees, which provide a natural canopy, keeping the trail relatively cool even during the scorching summer. As I journeyed back, a peculiar stench filled the air. It was vile, like spoiled meat left out to bake in the sun. I have a pretty strong stomach thanks to the few grisly scenes we deal with as rangers. And boy, have I smelled some really bad roadkill during my rounds. But this smell, it was worse. Like a mixture of rancidity and decay that only something quite large and quite dead could emit. It made me gag and my eyes water. The possibility of a deceased animal near a major trail was a red flag. So acting like the responsible ranger I am, I decided to investigate. Pinching my nose, I followed the smell off trail into the denser woods. It was strange though. Wind Cave is usually teeming with the scuffles of woodland critters and bird calls, but there was this eerie silence. It was like the very woods itself was afraid to breathe. Suddenly, I heard a low sound that sent a cold shiver down my spine. It was a growl, but unlike any growl I'd heard before. I'm familiar with pretty much every noise our resident wildlife species can make, but this was different. It was less of a growl and more of a rumbling grunt. I reached for my sidearm, instantly regretting my decision to leave my rifle in the truck today. I crept silently in the direction of the sound, my heart pounding like a jackhammer, and then I saw it, a hulking, shadowy figure looming amidst the underbrush. It was big, easily 7 feet tall, covered in dark brown, almost black fur. But that's not what froze my blood. Its body, its stature, it was much like a human's. It had broad shoulders, muscular arms, but it was standing upright on hind legs reminiscent of a dog's. I felt a lump forming in my throat as my eyes moved to its face. It had a long, pronounced snout, with whiskers that twitched, seemingly picking up my scent, and a row of sharp yellow teeth glistening in the dusky light. The fur around its snout looked coarse, more gray than brown, and it leered at me with deep-set, glowing yellow eyes. It was like looking into the eyes of a predator sizing up its prey, something I had not experienced until that moment. One powerful hand or paw dug into the earth while the other was clamped around what appeared to be a deer carcass, easily explaining the putrid odor. Its snarl broke the silence again, echoing through the silent forest. It reverberated inside my chest like a second heartbeat. Needless to say, there was no effing way I was sticking around for a meet and greet with this thing. I tried to back away slowly, remembering all those survival shows that recommend not showing fear to an animal. A lot easier said than done when you're staring down what I can only describe as a hybrid werewolf. I was almost clear when I trod on a stick. The loud crack echoed like a gunshot. I prayed it didn't spook the creature, but then I heard it howl. The sound of it I'm sure will haunt my dreams until my dying day. Pressed by fear, I bolted, zigzagging among the trees, their familiar smell left tainted by that encounter's sourness. Soon I was back on the ranger's trudge, my safe, familiar trail. Strangely, as soon as I re-emerged on the trail, the forest sounds resumed, though they were now overshadowed by my pounding heart. I made it back to the main office breathing heavily, and hoping I was at least somewhat safe. The sun was setting, casting shadows across the lush woodland, and I found myself yanking all the curtains closed. As I contemplated over the evening's insanity, I couldn't help but grapple with my own fear, disbelief, and my responsibility as a park ranger. Not everyone believed my story, and I can't blame them. But I stood my ground. I rerouted the nearby trails and warned campers of aggressive bears in the area so no one else would run into this thing. The night was restless, but the break of dawn brought some relief. The creature, or the dog man as some locals came to call it, no longer haunted my every thought, but it seared in my memory. I often find myself looking over my shoulder during my patrols. Life in the wild is unpredictable, and we never really know what lurks behind the veil of wilderness. Hey Donovan, one hell of a story to share. Writing from Yellowstone National Park here. Been working as a park ranger for about 2 years now. Always loved the outdoors, so I thought this was the perfect job for me. Keep the park clean, make sure visitors are safe. You know the drill. Yellowstone's not all just old faithful and magnificent landscapes, though. It's got its share of the wild and the weird. But the story I'm about to tell you trumps everything I've ever experienced here. So, I was just doing my routine rounds one late afternoon, checking for any lost items, mending some of the older trail signs, the usual. Anyway, I walked past one of our old field offices that we didn't use anymore. An old wooden hut, must have been built in the 60s or 70s. It was always locked up tight and we're not given access to it. I mean, why would anyone care about an old beat-up shack, right? But that day, I noticed the door ajar. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to check it out, thinking it might just be kids messing around or some wild animal that had found its way in. That's where I stumbled upon these old files, covered in a thick layer of dust, shoved in a beaten-up filing cabinet. The most intriguing of all files was this one that contained a detailed underground map. Now, I know the layout of this park like the back of my hand, but this map, it made no sense. It showcased large chambers, corridors, entire structures located deep beneath the park areas. Give me a moment to paint this visual for you. Imagine a huge mind map turned into an old-school Dungeons & Dragons dungeon sketch. Only these were no dungeons. The strange map details were annotated with distances, exact coordinates, and, the weirdest part, containment cell numbers. It was like something out of a sci-fi horror movie. A creepy water-stained yellowed map marking an underground facility that no one in the park management knew existed. There was this faint scent to the map. Off-putting, sour, bit like rotten eggs, I reckon. Can't really put a finger on it, it was quite bowl over. Right after I'd studied the map more closely, I started to hear this low, deep sound coming from below the shack. A grumble, kind of like a moan morphing into a long, drawn-out growl. Now I've heard a fair share of wild animal sounds, lived around them long enough. But this, Donovan, this was something completely different, deeper, scarier. It reverberated through the shack, stronger with each passing second. Just as this chilling sound wrapped up its eerie symphony, there was a knock that echoed through the chambers. A loud, thrumming knock, one that makes you feel like you're on the edge of a long-forgotten abyss. The map, the sound, the knock, everything seemed to conjoin into creating this unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach. I felt an overwhelming strangeness, a feeling I wish upon no one. Decided to call it a day and make a swift exit from the shack. On one of the future occasions, I decided to ask my supervisor about the old field office and what it might have housed in the past. I decided to dig deeper into this mystery. Now, I wasn't exactly part of an X-Files episode, but I pretty much felt like it. I followed that old map, and it led me into the belly of Yellowstone, to places not seen by casual visitors or even most of my fellow park rangers. Not gonna lie to you, I was nervous as all hell. The place had an eerie vibe to it. The deeper I went, the worse the smell got. Really putrid, like old rotten garbage. It was damp and cold, and darker than night itself. My flashlight did little to pierce the gloom, but I carried on. I made my way through husky corridors, across damp earth, under cobweb-laden arches. Not gonna lie, the ambience was unnerving, and couple that with the low moaning sound I could hear from deep within. Not quite the outdoor adventure I had in mind. Okay, worst part? I felt like I wasn't alone. Like I kept hearing this huffing noise, like a large animal. Now I'd say I was used to dealing with animals during my day-to-day work. But this felt different. Worse, because that huffing was followed by this guttural sort of grunting sound. That's when I saw it. My flashlight beam illuminated a massive shape. I nearly dropped the flashlight as it reflected off red fur. I'd seen loads of animals out in the wild, Donovan, but I ain't ever encountered anything that tall and hulking in my life. The damn thing had to be at least 8 feet tall. It was bulky, powerful, the kind of beast that could uproot trees and men alike with relative ease. Its head towered fluorescently in my flashlight. Its facial features were hard to make out in the dull light, but it had a pronounced forehead, a pronounced jawline, deep-set eyes, and a broad cheek. But the worst was its smell, a vile combination of spoiled meat and damp earth. Now, I've heard stories, of course. Every seasoned outdoorsman has. Stories of the Sasquatch. But those are just tales spun by campfires and in the corners of old man bars. But standing that close to such a monster staring at it, I was frozen with fear. In the next few moments, the beast let out a prolonged howl, so loud and deep it froze my blood. It sent shivers down my spine, and then it was just gone. It banged the ground hard one time, like a warning knock, before rushing off into the outward darkness. I didn't stick around to see if it was going to return. I shot out of there like a rocket, determined to see daylight again. When I finally broke through from the depths back into reality, I almost kissed the ground. Since then, I've been wrestling with this experience. What did I see? What's hiding beneath Yellowstone? Where do I go from here? I'm looking over my shoulder, questioning my role here every day since this encounter. Living and working in Yellowstone National Park has never been the same for me. But one thing's for sure, though. The park's image of picturesque landscapes and simmering geysers might be just the top layer of something far more surreal and wild than we ever thought. Till next time, Donovan. Wish me luck. Stan. Hey there, Donovan. I wanted to share this story with you from a few years back, during a chilly night here in Yellowstone National Park. First off, let me tell you that there are 2 types of night shifts when you're a park ranger. The kind where the loneliness and the silence get to you, and the kind that you can't explain. The kind that makes you think about all sorts of things you would rather not. There's a certain serenity to the park at night, this feeling of peace that just envelops you. As an experienced park ranger and a true nature lover, I'd felt it numerous times, that certain tranquility that could only be found with a million stars above, and the smell of evergreens all around. There was something sacred about the wild during the witching hours. It was your most intimate encounter with Mother Nature. Working the night shift wasn't all bad, though. It certainly gives you a lot of time for reflection, and the solitude can be quite comforting. I've always felt a sense of responsibility towards the park, my duty to guard it against all threats. Not just the physical threats like poachers or careless tourists, but the invisible ones too. The night shift generally involved me making rounds, checking the park's perimeter, and patrolling nearby areas, including some of the lesser tread paths. There's a surveillance system in place as well, where you can monitor various places across the park. All in all, it was mostly peaceful, save for some occasional animal noises in the background. On full moon nights, the park would be bathed in a haunting glow, trees casting long, gnarly shadows, everything looking a bit ethereal, This particular night was just like any other. The moon was clear but not too bright. The stars were twinkling like crazy. It seemed as though the whole park was asleep. The elk, the bison, even the wolves seemed to be taking the night off. Everything was calm. The wind hummed gently, shushing the trees. It was the kind of calm that was eerie, the one that felt like something was about to happen. I shrugged the feeling off, attributing it to the quiet stillness. The calm before the storm, I thought. Little did I know what storm awaited me. I was in the middle of my normal duties, monitoring various cameras installed throughout the park. The screen seemed to be playing a monochrome slideshow of desolate scenes. Some long-limbed shadows over an empty clearing, the waterfall cascading into the river with no one to hear her, trails snaking into the darkness that held untold mysteries. I stared at them, caught up in the odd beauty of the park at night. It was time to start the nocturnal patrol. I grabbed the keys to the patrol vehicle and zipped up my jacket as the winter chill had started to bite. As I stepped out of the warm cocoon of the office, the cold night air greeted me like a long-lost friend. It was time to shake off the nocturnal serenity, time to perk up the senses and embrace the other side of night shifts, the side that had given me enough goosebumps for a lifetime. After stepping out of the station into the night, I realized something felt different. On a regular night, sounds of the woods became a part of you. You can hear the rhythm, the whistling wind, the creek's soft murmur, the rustling leaves. They whisper secrets only a trained ear can understand. The shadows moved when they were supposed to, giving away lurking animals or fluttering birds. But that night, it felt like things were hiding. Then the first strange thing happened. My flashlight flickered as though the battery was dying, but I knew I'd changed them recently. I whacked it against my hand a few times. You know, the good old-fashioned way to fix things. It steadied but gradually dimmed to a faint glow that barely pierced the darkness. The second anomaly came shortly. As I was patrolling, I heard a whisper. It was odd, like a hiss in the wind. Its origin unknown. Its intention unclear, but the presence was palpable. No one was around, yet I felt watched, like an intruder stepping into a domain where he didn't belong. I brushed the uneasy feelings off as jitters from being alone at night. Yet, in my truck, unease turned to dread. The averted shadows, flickering lights, and eerie whispers coalesced into a word I hadn't once even thought of associating with Yellowstone: haunted. Suddenly, the peace and tranquility felt more like a hollow echo of something long lost. Throughout the night, the phenomena continued. Whispering winds seemed to carry lost souls' tales. My equipment was manipulated by unseen forces, and the shadows danced of their own accord. I even started sensing cold spots. The longest night of my life, somehow, managed to turn into dawn. Its first light seemed to banish the unseen, the abnormal. The awful presence seemed to fade with the darkness. In the end, it was just me, the same park ranger, in the same park, around the same time. Only now, there was a clear before and after associated with the night. With sunrise, things went back to normal. Nobody believed my story, attributing it to the loneliness and isolation of a nighttime park ranger. I wish they were right. The thing about encountering something like this, it sticks with you. The whispering wind is now a constant reminder. The cool breeze now feels like that ghostly chill, and the darkness, well, I am now on daytime shifts only. The whole encounter has made me question the park, the safety, even my own sanity. And that's my story, Donovan. Feel free to share it with others. Heck, maybe someone out there can explain what I experienced. I hope they can. I'm an outdoors type of guy. I love the crisp, clear air, the rustling sounds of the forest, the silent conversations trees seem to have when the wind blows. I could spend hours walking under the towering pines, just for a chance to catch a glimpse of a rare bird or a deer grazing. You could probably guess that I would be the one to have an encounter in the woods with a creature that's hard to describe, hard to believe even. That's why I decided to write in. My story starts in Baxter State Park, Maine, an absolute gem of natural beauty, hidden away up north, the perfect place for my solitary walks, where I often lose myself in the vastness of the forest and the grandeur of the mountain. Now, I don't expect everyone to understand why I spend my precious time in the middle of nowhere, usually alone. But to me, the solitude soothes and refreshes me. No flashing screens, no ringing phones, no hardcore bosses, just me and nature. So there I was, just another beautiful day in the park. I parked my Jeep, grabbed my backpack, and started my journey into the woods. Birdwatching, hiking, the occasional examination of interesting foliage. I had no particular itinerary planned that day. By the time the sun was directly overhead, I'd made my way to a small clearing that gave me a great view of the surrounding trees. I decided to settle down there for a while, to enjoy my lunch and observe an oddly active squirrel. The park was engulfed in a soothing calm. The air smelled of earth and greenery, but suddenly I felt a shift. It's hard to explain in words, but just like before a thunderstorm, when the heavy silence gives way to an electric tension, the atmospheric shift was tangible. My cheerful squirrel went silent. The birds ceased their singing, and there was this odd thickness to the air, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Then, a strange smell cut through the forest air. It was like sulfur. I chalked it up to be a geothermal occurrence, or maybe a decaying carcass nearby, but the timing of it was too odd to be a coincidence. Right when everything was going quiet, and then suddenly this smell appeared. There was definitely something going on here, even though I didn't want to admit it at the time. Shaking off the creeping unease, I packed my stuff and pushed on, deeper into the woods. I had no idea that I was walking straight towards a confrontation that would leave me questioning the very fabric of reality. I started to hear sounds, rustling leaves, dry branches cracking under pressure. Something was in the woods with me, something big from the sound of it, and the smell was stronger too, choking the fresh forest air. Uncertain what it was, I proceeded with caution, suspense building up with each hesitant step. That's when I first saw its shadow, a silhouette, tall and bizarrely shaped, with features that didn't seem to belong to any one animal. I could discern a large figure, the height of a bear maybe, but thinner. I held my breath, focusing on the source of the disturbance, and braced myself for an encounter with a hungry bear. But that isn't what stepped out into the clearing in front of me. The creature that stood before me was something that made me question my own eyes and even my sanity. It was tall, about 9 feet high. The body seemed skeletal, like the exterior of an exoskeleton, but had a scaled skin texture. It looked like a strange amalgamation of different creatures. The head of a goat or perhaps a deer, with the body of a lizard and the wings of a bat. The creature had an exterior skull, giving it a demonic, terrifying appearance. Its eyes were like a strange goblin creature's, glowing yellow in the shade of the trees. A shiver ran down my spine as my eyes took in the bizarre sight. It was absurd, unbelievable. My rational mind cycled through possibilities. A trick of the light, a forest fire-induced hallucination. But the eerie smell of sulfur hung heavily in the air, like a dark perfume that underscored the monstrous reality standing before me. As the creature shifted, light cascading across its scaled skin, I realized this was no hallucination. It started to move toward me and I ran. I sprinted through the forest, my breath ragged. I didn't stop until I couldn't smell the strange sulfur stench anymore. When I finally stopped, panting and shaking, the forest returned to its usual chorus of pleasant sounds. I'd outrun the creature, if that was even possible. Or more likely, it decided not to chase me for whatever reason. Wrapping my mind around the encounter was another colossal task altogether. Could I go back to the park after that? Could I ever enjoy the solitude of nature again knowing such things existed? These were some of the questions flowing through my mind as I hastily packed my things and left. I wanted out of the woods, out of the park. Back home, the encounter kept replaying in my head. But would anyone believe me if I told them I encountered this thing? Would they think I'm insane, delirious, or worse? Even now, as I write this to you, I question if what I saw was real or just a figment of my imagination. Was the smell just some previously unknown geothermal activity in the area? I don't have answers, but I do know that in my solitary walks, I'll be on guard now more than I've ever been. Not just against the mundane wildlife, but against the mythological as well. I've got a crazy story for you, and it's one that still gives me goosebumps to this day. Some days I struggle to believe it myself. It happened about 3 years ago, out in Kodachrome Basin State Park, Utah. If you don't know it already, that place is a nature photographer's playground. Red rock pillars rising straight from the ground and sandstone chimneys pigmented with a myriad of colors. I've been a photography enthusiast for years now, and when I finally got some time off work, I decided to head out west. It was an overwhelming experience to be amidst such unsullied beauty. So, I reached the park, checked into my cabin, and without wasting any time, started exploring. I'd packed my trusty old Canon and tripod for the trip. It wasn't fancy by any means, but it worked well enough for me. I felt a sense of peace in that landscape that I hadn't felt in a while. I decided to hike up to Shakespeare Arch first, the largest natural arch in the park. From there, I could see miles of desert terrain baking in the afternoon sun. After a tiring day of shooting pictures and exploring, I decided to take a break. So, I set up my gear under the arch and sat down to rest, watching the sun's golden light starting to mellow, turning the desert and the pillars a softer hue in the evening light. It was breathtaking. Suddenly, my camera started acting funky. I was making a strange noise and the screen started flickering. I figured it was a battery issue, so I turned it off and decided to pack up my stuff. It was then I felt an odd chill run down my back. It was a clear day, not a hint of rain, let alone a storm. But the air shifted. It got cooler, heavier, and then I saw it. High up in the sky, I noticed a bright light moving erratically. It was just a tiny dot at first, but it grew larger and brighter as it drew closer. Now, I'm no expert on aircraft, but this thing moved weird. It wasn't like a normal plane or helicopter. I marveled at it, confusion giving way to fascination. There was a negative glow around it, subtle at first, but as it came closer, the entire object illuminated the sky in a metallic sheen. Now, I've seen drones, I've seen all sorts of aircraft in my city life, but nothing like this. This was a UFO kind of sighting, I'm sure of it. But how was I supposed to explain that to anyone? They just paint me as a guy who spent his day baking in the desert sun. But I swear to you, I wasn't hallucinating. It was there. As the object suddenly seemed to slow down, things went eerily quiet around me. I held my breath, my heartbeat almost audible in the absolute silence. I couldn't look away. For all I knew, I was about to be abducted or something. Then, everything changed in a flash, literally. From out of nowhere, a surge of light blinded me momentarily, and when I regained my vision, the biggest damn shock of my life awaited me. Hanging perfectly still about 50 yards above me was this behemoth of a thing, just hovering in midair. It was massive, larger than the biggest jetliner I'd ever seen. Yet, it was silent, completely quiet. It was like it was a ghost. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The thing was round, like a disc. It was sleek, metallic, and silver gray, reflecting the last bit of sunshine in the sky. The center had pulsating lights, alternating in color, red, blue, green, yellow, like some psychedelic Christmas decoration. But most bizarre was its movement. It hovered 1 minute and then would do a sharp spin or an abrupt jerk, defying everything I knew about aerodynamics. Stuffing down the rising panic, I fumbled for my camera, hoping to capture the spectacle. But the camera was still out of commission, completely dead. Cursing under my breath, I fell to the instinctive urge of the modern man and pulled out my cell phone and started filming. But before I could hit the button to start the video, I felt a bizarre push. It's hard to explain, but it felt as if something invisible was shoving me away. More like a force field generated by the object. Stumbling backward, I still couldn't take my eyes off that crazy UFO. Suddenly, It darted across the sky, zooming off into the horizon faster than any aircraft I'd ever seen. Blink and you'd miss it fast. One moment it was there, the next, gone. The silent desert returned. It took me a while to gather my wits. Every hair on my body was standing on end, and my palms were sweaty. My mind swam with questions. The sinking sun reminded me of the passing hours. Gathering my gear, I trudged back to my cabin, my mind filled with the day's happenings. I barely slept a wink that night, replaying the encounter again and again. The whole thing felt surreal. Next morning, I had to refund my park fees and head back to the city. The quiet desert, once so inviting, now was too much for me to confront. I've been back in the urban jungle for a while now, but the effect of that day hasn't ebbed one bit. Had big plans to showcase the amazing shots I took that day, but the camera never recovered. Told a few fellow shutterbugs about my strange encounter, but all I got were good-natured laughs and an exhortation to keep hydrated while on desert shoots. And that was that. I haven't seen anything like it since. I'd like to share one of the stranger experiences I've had in my life. And trust me, I've had a few. This one happened a few years back when I decided to take a day off and visit Palos Falls State Park in Washington State. Now, if you've never been to Palos Falls, it's worth the trip. Naturally carved over eons by the mighty Palouse River, the falls drop 200 stunning feet into the churning whitewater below. The raw beauty of the place, especially on a sunny day, is good enough to take your breath away. I was going through a bit of a rough patch at the time. Personal issues, work stress, the world weighing heavy on me. I just needed to get away for a few days and breathe some clean air. This park had been a childhood favorite of mine, and nostalgia and a wish for simpler times called me back. I'd gotten there just after sunrise. Now, if pictures have never done justice to anything, it was to the sunrise that occurs over the Palusa. It was just me, my thoughts, and the great expanse of the river. I spent the morning exploring the park, taking a long hike along the riverbank. As the sun started to dip in the afternoon, I settled down in a quiet spot overlooking the falls. Listening to the perpetual roar of the waterfall, my mind started to wander. Suddenly, I realized, as if in a dream, that the backdrop of water crashing into rocks was underscored by an odd noise. Initially, I brushed it off as nothing more than the result of my overactive imagination. Yet, as the sound persisted, it started to resemble more of a distinct rhythm, almost like something nearby was breathing heavily. Only, it wasn't coming from any wildlife I knew, or coming from the falls. It was the unmistakable sound of a large creature taking deep, long breaths. As soon as I registered what I was hearing, my heart raced, and I was overcome with a chill. Instinctively, I rose to my feet, readying myself for what could be out there in the bush. Now, here's where I should probably clarify. I'm not one known to get frightened easily. I've spent my fair share of time trekking, camping, and even hunting in the wilds, and I've seen the unpredictable side of nature. Some really strange stuff. But this was about to take the cake. The air felt heavier all of a sudden, thick with a certain discomfort that I can only describe as a very strong need to escape. It was as if every instinct in my body was telling me to move, to leave, that I was not alone and certainly not in good company. The sound then seemed to shift, altering from deep breaths into a soft growl, then back again. As I held my breath, fearing it could hear me, the sound continued, not growing louder or quieter, but appearing somehow nearer than it was a few moments ago. And yet, I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. The twilight's creeping shadows gave the unsettling feeling of a presence, hiding, watching even. I tried to convince my brain it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew it was more, something bigger, ominous even. Then, as I was scanning the tree line, I finally saw it, a tall, looming figure perched on a rocky outcrop. Its body was large, almost human-like, but with a hunched posture. It was draped in what seemed like black feathers, appearing smooth yet strangely angular in the waning light. And as I was registering the unusual silhouette, 2 crimson points suddenly flashed in my direction, completely devoid of warmth and cutting through the dim evening like lighthouses in a foggy night. I've locked eyes with predators before, but this was different. It was as if those glowing red orbs could see inside me, like they knew I was petrified. My brain was screaming at me to move, to run, but my legs refused to obey. The entity, or creature, then unfurled something enormous and dark, dimming the twilight even further. It was only then that I realized what it was. A set of wings, gargantuan and leathery, outstretched against the evening sky. The sight was terrifying, but at the same time, I wanted so badly to know what I was looking at. I don't know how long I stood there, but it felt like an eternity. A sudden snapping twig behind me broke my trance, and in an instant, the adrenaline kicked in, propelling me out of the clearing, through the thicket and toward my car. I remember stumbling over roots and rocks, my lungs burning from exertion, but fear kept me going. I wanted to know what it was, but my body somehow knew that I was in danger. Since that day, I've struggled to make sense of what I saw. At first, I thought it might have been a dream or some sort of hallucination. Maybe the stress got to me. Maybe I was imagining things. But every time I close my eyes, I can still see those crimson red eyes staring right into my soul. For weeks, I avoided going outside. Nature seemed to have lost some of its allure for me, and instead in its place was a pervasive sense of foreboding. Over time, however, I regained some of my nerve. I started taking short hikes, but never alone, and never at dusk. Sometimes things thought to be empty legends turn out to be anything but, and I don't have any intention to find out if any of the other tales of monsters are real or not. I think I'll leave that task to someone else. I have a story for you that's, well, it's something else. It happened at Starved Rock State Park here in Illinois. It was only a couple years back. I was there for a hike during the fall of the year. Less tourists during that time of year, so I had most of the park to myself, though I had my German Shepherd Max along for company. My usual route's a hilly 5-mile hike along the river. Now, on the day I'm telling you about, we'd been hiking for a couple of hours, and we're doing our last loop around the river trails. You know, just enjoying the wild serenity of the place, when Max began behaving oddly. Instead of darting about up ahead as usual, he was staying close. His ears perked up, and I swear, his eyes were practically glowing. He'd look over his shoulder constantly like he was expecting something to leap out from the trees. Initially, I thought that maybe he just caught scent of a squirrel or something. But then a weird smell hit my nostrils. It's hard to describe, but was something like sulfur. Something burning almost, but there were no signs of fire nearby. Whatever its source, it was strange and unpleasant. I've never come across anything like it before or since. We moved ahead, unease creeping up, when Max began growling softly, like he does when he wants to warn me of something. Now, when you're alone in the wilderness, even with a 100-pound German Shepherd, such a warning gets your heart racing. We reached a clearing that has this magnificent overlook. It's a great spot to rest, and I figured we could take a short break. But as we stepped into the clearing, both Max and I froze. A chill ran down my spine. I had this strange sensation. It was as if something else was there, though I could not see anything that would validate my thoughts. Max was still growling, although now it was louder and accompanied by an occasional whimper. I didn't need him to tell me we weren't alone. I remember swallowing my fear, trying to keep my tone steady as I called Max to my side. Ever so gingerly, I moved further into the clearing, my senses on high alert. As I ventured deeper, the smell intensified, making its way into my lungs and making me want to retch. And then, something unnatural brushed against the otherwise normal sounds of the wilderness. It was oddly soft and raspy at the same time, but more disturbing was a low, malevolent growl that vibrated under it. Then, just ahead of me, I saw something. I blinked, trying to make out the details but having no luck. The shape of it shimmered in a distorted manner, as though the creature was surrounded by heat waves or something. I was too far away to accurately identify the creature, though I could make out an outline that was both terrifying and bizarre. Something about it screamed wrong. This unexplained monstrosity was so out of place in the serene nature of the starved rock park. By now, Max was whining, his tail lowered and body pressed against my legs. Even in the dim light, I could see the fear in his eyes reflecting my own. A million thoughts were racing through my mind. What was that thing? What did it want? A primal part of me wanted to bolt, instinct screaming danger. All I knew was that the usual serenity of our beloved park was disrupted by the presence of this alien creature. I was standing there frozen, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. Suddenly, the thing moved. It lurched from the tree line into the pale moonlight, and I saw it, really saw it. It was nothing like I could have ever expected. The creature, or demon as I can only describe it, was around 6 feet tall, but that's not the half of it. The body of it was dark, black even, with a vaguely human shape, but all wrong. Not like an animal or a person, but a strange mixture of the two. It had this grotesque sort of skeletal exterior, almost like an insect. The skin of it seemed scaled and rough, and there were wings. They looked like the wings of a bat. I could see right through the thin membrane-like skin in the moonlight. But its face was the worst of it, like some demonic horse or goblin. The eyes, they glowed, bright red, just glowing in the moonlight. It had this long, disgusting tongue lolling out of its mouth. I can still remember those eyes staring at me. Max was losing it, whining and growling. His entire body churned with fear and protective aggression. As for me, I was so scared I couldn't move. All I could think of was the absurd creature straight from a nightmarish horror story that was standing in front of me. Part of me was sure it couldn't be real, but then there I was, staring straight at it. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it disappeared. I blinked, and it was just gone, vanished into the thin air as if it had never been there. Max and I stood alone in the ominous silence. The sulfur smell lingered, but the beast, whatever it was gone, leaving us both terrified and drenched in cold sweat. I will never forget that night. Every time I hike into Starved Rock, the memory of that encounter resurfaces. Max and I, we still go though. But now, every rustle, every sound from the unknown depths of the woods, it all raises my hackles. The park's calm serenity could no longer disguise the memory of this monstrous intruder. I've looked up the creature online, and the closest thing that fits the bill is something called the Jersey Devil, though the location is wrong. I don't know what else it could be. I don't know what belief is left in me for folklore, but I do know what I saw. It was real, and it was out there. And whether or not I'll encounter it again, I don't know. I want to tell you about an odd experience I had. It happened maybe 2 or 3 years ago now, at Silver Falls State Park out in Oregon. Beautiful place, you gotta go if you've never been there. But if you do, I hope you are ready for adventure, because I ran into something out there that I never thought existed. Not in a million years. It was just another average day for me, having some me time away from the hustle and bustle of life. In hindsight, I wonder if the beauty, the serenity of the place, is in part what made the whole thing so unnerving. I went there for a bout of soul-searching. You know, one of those periods in life where you need to take a breather and just experience something else. I was hiking along this trail that wound through the dense forest. I was taking my time, breathing in the crisp, fresh air. I was making my way to the falls when I saw something strange in the distance. There's a tunnel near the falls, where the trail actually goes behind it. It makes for an incredible view. That's where I was headed. I was about halfway to the falls when I saw it. Amidst the tranquility of the environment, something felt very off. At first, I thought I noticed a figure, a shadowy object, that really didn't seem to fit into the natural surroundings. But thinking about it, it wasn't the sight that struck me first. It was the smell. A sour, pungent stench hit me like a punch in the gut. So much so that I had to stop dead in my tracks. It was off-putting, to say the least, and it caught me completely off guard. Now, the smell had my senses heightened and my curiosity piqued. At first, I figured it could have been a long-deceased animal maybe. But the second thing that got me was the noise. I heard this strange sound through the trees, a sort of deep grunt, like the growl of something big. If you've ever heard a bear grumbling, it was somewhat like that, only it felt way too close for comfort. I decided to press forward a bit more. I wasn't sure if what I heard was real or not. The sense of unease was with me with each step I took, but I continued down the trail. The smell was growing stronger, and though the scenery became even more beautiful as I got closer to the falls, the atmosphere became thicker, dampening my earlier enthusiasm. I came to the edge of the woods, near the tunnel that leads behind the falls. The strange stench was at its strongest here. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. It was something large, hidden in the shadows near the mouth of the tunnel, beyond where the daylight could reach. And whatever it was definitely alive. I cupped my hand over my mouth to stifle the reaction to the atrocious smell, and squinted my eyes, desperately trying to make out what I was staring at. My heart pounded in my chest, and I remember feeling lightheaded, wondering if maybe I had inadvertently stumbled upon a bear, or perhaps some other large wild animal. The figure was difficult to make out in the shadows, but it was undoubtedly large, incredibly so, and it was moving in an odd, hulking manner. And then, out of the shadows stepped something inexplicable. A creature, a being, I'm still hesitant to believe was real. It was enormous, and I mean big. We're talking around 9 feet tall easily. Its enormousness was eerie. It was solid, hulking, like a slab of living stone. Its body was covered in dense brownish-red hair. The face was the strangest part. It had a broad, flat nose with wide, flaring nostrils, bulging cheekbones and thick brows above deep-set eyes. They were almost human, but not quite. I'll never forget those eyes. Even in the dim light, they sparked a fear in me that I'd never felt before. The jaw was strong and pronounced, jutting out with evident power, and from its mouth I could see oversized teeth. Suddenly, it let out a deep, earth-shaking howl, like nothing I'd heard before. The sound thrummed in my chest and echoed in my skull. I felt a sense of primal fear, a sensation I'd only read about but never truly experienced. There seemed to be no aggression in the beast, but nevertheless, I was frozen in place. Unthinking, I stumbled backward, maintaining eye contact until I tripped, falling hard onto the ground. The last thing I saw was a fleeting glimpse of the creature's reddish form as it disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel. I made it out of the forest as fast as my trembling legs could carry me. The park, which had been my serene refuge, had unveiled a darker side that day. Post-incident, my mind stayed stuck on the encounter. There was a sense of unrest gnawing at me in the quiet hours of the night. It was almost as if, by venturing out into the woods that day, I'd crossed an invisible line into a world I never knew existed, a world that I was ill-prepared for. I tried to rationalize it, debated whether it was a hallucination or not, but the memory remains, clear and vivid as the day it happened. I began to scour the internet, seeking anyone else who might have had a similar encounter. I found story after story of people who had had encounters just like mine, encounters with the creature known as Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I never believed in such things, but the memories of that day tell me otherwise. I'll never forget the day I encountered something almost beyond explanation. It was a sunny afternoon in Custer State Park, South Dakota, a place untouched by the taint of city pollution, home to the kind of peace you only realize you've missed when you're finally in the midst of it. So there I was, standing among the emerald canopies and rugged landscapes. While it might not seem like it, the Black Hills are the start of the Rockies. The mountains here aren't as massive, but they are unique and definitely worth exploring if you get the chance. But a lot of the visitors here come for the wildlife. I'd cross paths with coyotes, bison, elk, even bobcats. My day started like any other. I had breakfast, did a little bird watching. You've probably heard about the park's famous bird watching spots. I mean, with over 200 species calling this park home, it's pretty hard to miss the buzz. For me, it's not about the numbers. It's about the rare chance to step into the world of these wild creatures. Looking back, birdwatching was probably what kept me sane throughout my life. There's something strangely therapeutic about watching these creatures go about their daily routines. I decided on a hike that day. Stratobold Trail seemed like the perfect choice for its beautifully diverse landscapes. It had been a few hours into the hike when it happened. Just as I was coming around a bend in the trail, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye gave me pause. At first glance, it seemed to be just a large bird of some sort. However, a closer inspection roused my curiosity. There was something peculiar about its form. It was shrouded beneath the thick foliage, flickering sporadically as it moved. It was, in a word, odd. The normal chirping and rustling sounds of the forest seemed to fade out, replaced by an almost deafening silence. The kind of silence that was all-engulfing, that made you hyper-aware that there was something going on that shouldn't be. A sense of unease began to crawl up my spine. Still, I stood there watching the thing in the bushes. Its movements had a languid, almost mesmerizing quality to them, making it hard to ID the creature. One moment it seemed to be the size of a hawk. The next it resembled something closer to a deer. Its figure seemed fluid, morphing in sync with the shadowy veil of the forest. Was I looking at some kind of shapeshifter? I was acutely aware that I was likely in danger. I don't know why I stayed there. Maybe it was my curiosity, my need to know what was going on. As I continued to watch, a feeling washed over me. The air seemed to hum with an unseen energy, hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. It was like being under the gaze of a predator, and that's when I saw its eyes. Or at least what I assumed to be its eyes. They were alien, dark, but the space surrounding them seemed to glow. I've never seen anything like them before. There was an intelligence in those eyes. I could tell that much. Mesmerized, I found myself stepping closer under the creature's watchful gaze. Unexpectedly, a soft chiming sound broke the silence, emanating from the creature's location. It was like no bird song I had ever heard. Was this creature trying to communicate? Conscious of my racing heart, I stood planted in my spot, every sense heightened, far from what I'd imagined my day off in Custer State Park would bring. As soon as I steeled my nerves again, readying myself to approach the peculiar figure, it disappeared into the dense undergrowth with a sudden whoosh. The forest seemed to resume its natural soundtrack, the familiar chirping of birds and rustling of leaves slowly creeping back into consciousness. The silence and the stillness felt unsettling, the forest's familiar sights and sounds echoing hollow in light of the recent events. But, as they say, curiosity killed the cat. So, I decided to venture deeper into the wilderness, following the direction in which the creature had disappeared. As apprehensive as I felt, there was no ignoring the itch of curiosity that enticed me to uncover the creature's origins. Overlaying the next few hours was an eerie sense of expectation. I couldn't leave this mystery unanswered. I'd never be able to live with myself. Each rustle of the leaves, every fleeting shadow, had me on edge. Eyeing the underbrush with renewed concentration, I ventured into the lesser explored parts of my beloved park. But alas, whatever I'd encountered earlier had seemingly vanished. Just when disappointment began to tinge my adventure, a resonating hum bounced around the forest. It was more of a feeling than a sound, kind of like when you stand too close to a working generator. There were no descriptive words for what happened next. In the blink of an eye, a deep silver sheen flashed across the dusky sky. It was as sudden as it was spectacular. I stood aghast, tracking the gleaming trail above me in the sky. There was something in the sky, but what was it? It seemed metallic in nature, but was able to change form, just like the creature with those glowing eyes from the forest earlier. At first it looked like a snake-like creature, like a wingless dragon even, but the next moment it was cylindrical, like some sort of flying craft. I was completely flabbergasted. Everything clicked into place for me. Whatever this thing was, spirit, monster, alien ship, it was something to do with those eyes I saw in the woods. I knew I should leave, but I couldn't help just standing there in a stupor. The object hung above me, eerily mid-air, before accelerating away at an inconceivable speed. I was completely unaware of time at that moment. Was my strange encounter mere minutes, or had I been standing there for hours? I had no idea. In what felt like a surreal haze, I stumbled back to my car. Driving back, the car radio spouted cheerfully. The world continued spinning for everyone else, oblivious of my run-in with the otherworldly entity. Too complex to grasp, the encounter challenged reality, forcing me to question the existence of a broader spectrum of life. To this day, I still don't have any answers. Was it some type of unknown creature? Personally, I don't think it was anything from this planet, but you can decide for yourself. I'm only here to give you my account. You can believe what you will. I guess to start off, I should provide a bit of context. It was about 2 years ago. My wife Amy and I had decided to take a vacation. We were both wiped out from work overload and the general stress of life, so we figured a good dose of nature would do the trick. We chose Fall Creek Falls State Park in Tennessee. To those unaware, it's an absolute beauty with dozens of springs, waterfalls, and gorges. The type of spot where you could just lose track of time, watching the birds and squirrely critters in the woods. I've got to admit I was looking forward to the scenery and the peace just as much as Amy was. She was keen on exploring, and I was all for it in the hope it would disconnect us from our everyday routine, if only for a few cherished days. We arrived there in July. The weather was just right, albeit a bit hot, but that's pretty typical of Tennessee weather. We set up our small campsite near the Spring Creek and made our plans to explore the park. Over the next few days, we went hiking, followed some nature trails, observed the local wildlife with binoculars from safe distances, and even tried some bird watching. I think we might have spotted an eagle, but I wouldn't bet my life on it. This particular night started off the same as the others. We cooked up some hot dogs on our camping stove, washed it down with a few beers, and shared the stories of our favorite moments from the day. As the fire started to die down, Amy decided to retire for the night, but I stayed out, enjoying the solitude. I added a couple of logs to the fire, pulled up my chair, and sat watching the darkness play hide and seek with the flames. The chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind created a relaxing symphony that was far more pleasing to my ears than the constant blaring horns and rattle of the city we lived in. That's when it started, as if the volume button on the night's sounds had been turned all the way down. The entire woods fell frighteningly quiet. The only sound at play now was the crackling fire and my own shallow breaths. The abrupt silence sent a chill down my spine, and I strained my ears trying to catch any semblance of life around me. I don't know how much time passed, but just as suddenly, a howl shattered the silence. It was a sound I'll never forget. It was enough to send my heart racing and have every hair on my body stand on end. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was probably only a wolf, but the pit of my stomach knew better. The sound was far more aggressive and guttural than any wolf I'd ever heard. And to further my fears, it sounded close. Too close for comfort. And then there was the smell, a sickly stench that wafted on the night air, making my eyes water and stomach churn. It was putrid, like rotting meat left out under the sun. In all my years of camping and hiking, I'd never come across anything that reeked so horribly. It was the kind of smell you can taste at the back of your throat, the type that makes you want to purge your stomach. Between the frightening silence, the soul-piercing howl, and the nauseating stench, my nerves were unraveling rapidly. My mind struggled to put together what was happening, but unfortunately, my encounter with the unknown was still not over. The shadows seemed to be playing tricks on me, moving and shifting in an unnatural way, just beyond the firelight's reach. I squinted into the darkness, my mind still trying to piece together what my eyes were taking in, but it seemed like a part of the shadows detached, forming a mass much denser and darker than its surroundings. It was big, bigger than any animal had the right to be. It appeared slightly hunched, almost like it couldn't contain its size. The fire crackled, throwing a rogue spark out, and for a second, my eyes caught a hint of yellow, a reflection perhaps, but the rational corner of my brain knew better. There were eyes staring back at me from the shadows. I stared into the black mass, willing my eyes to adjust. But the more I looked, the less I understood. Was this a trick of the shadows? Was I dreaming? I couldn't quite discern. What I did know is there was something out there watching me, but I didn't know what. I reached out for the flashlight next to me. As my shaky fingers closed around it, I found myself questioning whether shedding light on it would bring relief or just haunt my dreams for years to come. With every tainted breath I drew in, and with a sense of dread eating at me, I flicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on a horrifying figure. A dark, seemingly huge, beastly creature standing on two legs, like a man, but it wasn't. It was some sort of dog-human hybrid. Its scruffy fur coat was of a color so dark, it seemed to absorb what little light there was. The creature itself easily stood 7, maybe even 8 feet tall. Even from my distance, I could make out its broad shoulders and a muscular frame that was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. But that wasn't the most frightening part. This creature had the long snout and pronounced brow ridge of a dog. Thick whiskers twitched, and, in what I can only describe as a grotesque display, its lips pulled back into a snarl, revealing a set of deadly teeth that glinted white in the dull light. The taste in my mouth went from bile to base fear as my flashlight beam landed upon its eyes. It had deep-set eyes that glowed a furious yellow, locking onto me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. The air around me felt charged, and my skin crawled as if alert to some unseen danger. The unwelcome stench of decay seemed to grow stronger, into my nostrils, clinging to my clothes. Disgusting and overbearingly nauseating. A second deep growl escaped from the creature's throat. The sound was terror personified, and it rooted me to my place. Driven by adrenaline and sheer survival instinct, I threw my flashlight at the creature and dashed towards our tent where Amy was. I yelled for her to wake up, to get her stuff, that we needed to leave ASAP. Within what seemed like an eternity, we were both in the car, tires screeching against the gravel path, as we made our hasty retreat. In the following days, I caught myself continually going over the events in my mind, the creature's horrifying image like a grisly picture that wouldn't fade away despite my best attempts. Were my eyes playing tricks on me? Was it merely a shadow born from the fear of the unknown? I may never have the answers. Eventually, I stumbled upon stories similar to mine from other campers and hikers. Stories of a creature bearing sinister eyes with a hulking form referred to as the Dogman. The validation was more horrifying than comforting. However, with time, I learned to live with that night, the memory tucked away into the corners of my mind. Only now, I'm more careful, vigilant, and respectful of the dark, misty corners I'd once taken for granted. I've got a weird story for you. Believe it or not, that's up to you. I'm just telling you what I saw. It was a beautiful sunny day in Alabama, and I was headed for Gulf State Park. I'd been needing a break from the hustle and bustle of daily life, and nothing quite does it like a bit of nature. I've been to that park more than a few times in my life, but that day felt odd from the start. The whole place seemed different, eerily quiet. Birds weren't chirping their usual tunes. Even the trees seemed quiet, as if they were afraid the wind might blow and make a noise. I remember spending the morning just walking around, trying to spot different types of birds, maybe catch a sight of a chipmunk or two. Nothing too exciting. Lunchtime found me on the shore of Lake Shelby, just sitting there, mind as serene as the water. You could almost forget the rest of the world exists when you're in a place like that. Well, at least until my stomach started growling, louder than any creature in the woods. I'd packed some sandwiches, nothing fancy, just ham and cheese. But eating it there, with the sun shining and the water lazily lapping against the shore, I swear it tasted like a 5-star meal. After eating, I even had a lazy nap under the shade of an old pine. After that glorious nap, I felt good, recharged. I decided to explore a bit more off the beaten path. Now I tend to be a bit adventurous, and that day was no different. I ventured deeper into the woods, away from the lake. It turned out to be more than I bargained for. I'd been following this sort of natural trail, pushed down by animals or wind or who knows what. The vegetation grew pretty thick, towering trees, dense underbrush, the works. Greenery's nice, but it made for a bit of a challenge to navigate. Then, right when I was about to turn back, I felt it. You know that feeling when you think someone's watching you? Yeah, that one. It's not paranoia if it turns out to be true, right? Well, what started as a feeling quickly escalated into a sense of unease, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling uncomfortably. I started to hear a deep, echoing sound in the distance. It rang through the dense vegetation. It wasn't like anything I've heard before. Not the yelp of a fox or the chatter of a squirrel. This was something else, something bigger, and I could feel it deep in my gut. Before I knew it, I saw something moving in the distance. It looked huge and broke through tree branches in its path with ease. It was beastly, and the earth seemed to tremble beneath it as it moved. Even in the filtered sunlight, I noticed a certain bulk to its form, but kept in shadow. It never came into clear view, always partially obscured by the underbrush or behind trees, remaining intriguingly elusive and all the more terrifying. The startling part came when it found a clearing. Suddenly, there was this terrible, powerful odor that wafted upwind towards me. It was stale, an acrid stench that made my nose wrinkle, like spoiled meat. It was so strong, so out of place in the clean forest air. What happened next was straight out of a childhood nightmare. I heard a gritty, guttural sound emerge from the depths of the woods. It was a growl or a roar, low in pitch but resonating through the trees. Instinctively, I backed off, heart thrumming wildly against my chest. With the onset of approaching twilight, the forest depths became increasingly shadowed. The mysterious creature remained hidden, its form nothing but a ghostly outline dwarfed by the trees. Still, despite its elusiveness, I am sure I know what it was that I saw. I don't imagine there are too many other large bipedal creatures roaming around the forest. I know it sounds impossible, but I'm sure it was a Sasquatch. I didn't wait any longer and got out of there as quickly as I could. I didn't run. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, but I didn't linger out there any longer than I absolutely had to. That encounter changed the mood of the day right on its head, and quickly too. I glanced over my shoulder every so often, expecting to see the creature again, but it never showed itself. Part of me was certainly relieved, but another part wanted a better look at the creature, just to know that my imagination wasn't getting the best of me. Every rustle, every broken twig, every falling leaf set me on edge on the return journey. It was turning dusk when I finally made it back to the car. Even in the safety of the car, every little noise had me jumping. I was never one to believe in stories of monsters or even local legends, but now I'm not so sure. I've been back to that park since the encounter, but I haven't yet ventured off trail again. Part of me wants to see what else is out there, but I have the sense to know when to leave well enough alone. Hey Donovan, so this happened about 3 years ago. I was sitting at home one summer day, trying to beat the heat. In case you're wondering, I lived in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and my house overlooked this old, seemingly abandoned building. I had always been intrigued by this building. It just sat there on the edge of the neighborhood, stripped of any life. The worn-out red bricks, the twisted metal infrastructure of what once was likely a booming factory of some kind. It definitely seemed eerie. But hey, I didn't bother nobody about it, even if it was just across from my place. Well, that particular day was what we usually call a scorcher. I was lying on my old worn-out couch covered in sweat and trying to remember clearly when I last got the AC serviced. But that's not the point of the story, but it's what I consider the pieces of normality before things got far from normal. It was around noon, I think. Now, generally, with a heat like that, the neighborhood was quiet during midday. Even the local kids dared not play outside. It was the kind of silence where you could distinctly hear the hum of a passing by vehicle or someone's lawnmower from several blocks away. Anyhow, I'm there, losing the battle against the heat, when I notice some movement near the old building in my sleepy peripheral vision. Who would be moving around the deserted warehouses at this time, in this sauna-like weather? I was curious. I decided to investigate, at least from the cool confines of my scorching hot living room. I grabbed my binoculars from the drawer by the window, where I like to indulge in amateur bird watching on pleasant days, and had a look-see at the building. Well, I wish I could say it was teenagers up to shenanigans, but that wasn't it. This was different. I noticed a couple of black vans parked in front. They looked new, shiny, out of place amidst the dusty bricks and rusty steel of the facility. Just as I was thinking about it, a group of men, all dressed in black suits, stepped out. No, not the common folk that you'd usually expect to see around here in Green Bay. They moved into the building with this strange sense of urgency and purpose, their faces stern and hidden behind pitch-black sunglasses. This was at the height of the midday sun, baking asphalt and wilting flowers. And there they were, strutting around in their brand new black suits without a bead of sweat. At this point, I thought my brain was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the heat stroke or dehydration creeping up on me. But then, I noticed a flickering light inside the building. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was definitely odd. Subtle changes in hue, from a sharp white to soft blue, then an eerie green. Didn't make sense for a building that was supposed to be abandoned, right? So, there was this otherworldly glow I noticed inside the building, bouncing off the walls inside. Ordinarily, I would have made up my mind there and then to call the cops, but an odd fascination held me back. Perhaps it was the strange flurry of activity around the deserted building, or the odd timing of it all. I decided to keep watching, half in fear, half in curiosity. As the men were moving around inside, every so often carrying out some peculiar-looking equipment to their vans, there was this intensity to them. As I kept observing, I noticed more vans arriving, quietly, without causing a stir. The sun began to drop beyond the horizon, and the eerie green light inside the building somehow grew even more intense. I sat there captivated, my eyes straining in the dim twilight to keep tabs on their activities. Then it happened. Something shifted. It's hard to describe it in words. The air around the building momentarily shimmered, like heat radiating off a sweltering road, and then everything went dark. The strange men ceased their activities as dark figures against the background of the now silent building. I must have jumped nearly 3 feet in the air when my phone rang, breaking the silence of that sweltering summer evening. It was the local pizza delivery guy, who must have thought I was mad, as the odd occurrences made me completely forget I had ordered a pizza. After hanging up, I turned back to the window, gripping the binoculars, expecting the spectacle to continue. But instead, I was met with an empty, quiet street. No men, no vans, and the old abandoned building stood there once more, silent and lifeless. In the aftermath, I was left with more questions than answers. Was it some sort of black ops secret facility conducting an undercover operation? Was it just my fanciful imagination, spurred on by the unforgiving heat of the day? I even went as far as asking the neighborhood kids, who I thought might dig around for adventure, but none was the wiser. Everything felt too surreal and strangely unsettling. Needless to say, I never saw any activity around the building again, but its presence, looming at the corner of the street, started symbolizing something more sinister to me than just worn-out bricks and rusted metal. The sleepless nights following the incident were full of ominous dreams, and I started considering moving. Even looking at the building was enough to give me an eerie, unsettling feeling. To this day, the puzzling string of events keeps bugging me. The thought, what were they doing in that building, has stubbornly decided to resurface in my mind every now and then, always accompanied by the chilling memory of the intense green light. Piece of advice from me to your viewers: if you ever come across a seemingly normal sight that triggers this odd sinking feeling in your gut, maybe you should trust your instincts. I guess I've always felt most at home while floating down a river. I like being surrounded by the subtle sounds of nature. the rhythmic lapping of water at my canoe, the hum of cicadas. And while I'm not normally one for sharing these types of stories, this particular experience was too strange to keep to myself. It was on one of these trips, a lazy Saturday in Providence, Rhode Island. I usually go canoeing in the heart of summer when everything's vibrant and lively. I find it an ideal way to soothe my mind from the buzz of city life. That day started like any other. The sky was a clear blue with scattered puffy clouds. I'd been out on the water since early morning, stopping now and then to catch my breath, have a light snack, or just recline and admire the view. I had paddled quite a distance away from Providence downtown and reached the peaceful and secluded spots where the river wound through the heart of the forest. There was a sort of comforting greenness in those moments, looking at all the shades from mint to pine. As I silently glided across the river, I looked closer at the things around me. Funny how within these quiet moments, you notice the smallest details that you never did before, like the ripples in the water as a fish swam by, or the minutiae of a dragonfly's wings as it hovered over lily pads. I slid my paddle through the water, steering my way closer to the edge where the maples leaned over the water. I reveled in this moment of serene solitude, oblivious to the strange unfolding that was soon to befall. I was about to head back when an odd clicking sound shattered the stillness. It was definitely out of place, not at all like the typical chorus of nature sounds I was used to. Intrigued and bemused, I decided to paddle further upstream to investigate. Slowly moving towards the sound, my eyes were scanning the tree line, searching for what could be producing the strange click-clack. It felt a bit mechanical yet animalistic at the same time, a strangeness in the serene wilderness. I started feeling something unnatural, a growing sense of uncomfortable prickling at the back of my neck, a feeling of being watched. I've been out in the woods a good bit of my life, but I've never felt like this before. Being observed by something unseen yet palpable. It sent the hairs on my neck shooting up, and an unexplained chill ran down my spine, despite the summer heat. But in spite of the discomfort, my curiosity had taken hold of me, and I ventured further in, drawn towards the peculiar sounds. Little did I know, I was about to encounter something beyond my wildest imagination. Just as I was considering turning back, the normally lively sounds of the forest fell ominously silent. The vibrant chattering of the birds, even the slightest whispering rustle of the leaves, seemed to have been sucked out of the air. Yeah, I noticed the water around me changing too. Familiar ripples from passing fish and bugs were replaced with unusual, substantial splashes, like something quite big disturbing the surface. I paused, feeling every nerve in my body jangling like alarm bells. And that's when I saw it. Something unholy crawling on the riverbank just about 20 feet away from me. The clicking sound and the stirring water both were making sense now. It startled me to the core. This creature, it looked almost human but was distorted in a way that things of nightmares are. The way it moved, damn, it was terrifyingly abnormal. Crawling on its hands and feet, it was lightning fast with a surprising grace for something that ungodly. It was also quite tall for something that you'd normally see out here. It was maybe 5 or even 6 feet, just scrunched down like a contortionist in a box. Its body was entirely naked, as if void of any characteristics and absolutely pale. The head was the most off-putting part. Its face was, if you can term that a face, hollow, except for 2 humongous black eyes. It seemed to consume all the light around, like a void. There was an open and gaping mouth and no traces of a nose. But it was a living creature, and it was indeed making that clicking sound, producing a ghastly echo reverberating through the silence around. It was terrifying but also captivating in a way, like seeing a horrific car crash. You want to turn away, but you can't. I felt my heart thud against my ribs, every muscle frozen as if I was turned to stone. Just as abruptly it had appeared, the creature turned around and melted back into the forest, leaving in its wake a severely rattled me. I tried to regain control over my thoughts and body, every nerve of mine pulsing with adrenaline. Hastily, I turned my canoe around and paddled off in the other direction towards safety as quickly as possible, leaving behind the eerily quiet spot. Ever since that encounter, I can't help but question what happened that day. It feels like a dream, a really horrible one. But I have this irreparable sense of knowing that what I saw was real. It was there. It wasn't my imagination. And flares of fear still grip my heart when I try to picture that skeletal figure in my mind. Until this day, I have no solid explanation for what it could be. I've heard stories about mysterious creatures in the woods before, but until you see something like this with your own eyes, you don't truly believe it. That day, something changed in me. I saw something surreal, and it left a profound and long-lasting impact on me. It forever altered how I view the quiet wilderness of Rhode Island. I'm writing to you from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to tell you about an escapade I had that was absolutely insane. It was mid-August 2012, just after my 32nd birthday. I found myself standing at the base of the hauntingly inviting Franconia Ridge. The New Hampshire sky was clear with low humidity. A perfect day for climbing, or so I thought. I get those adrenaline surges about climbing. The thrill of the challenge, the rush of risk, and the satisfaction of conquering a wall can't be compared to anything. For me, it's more than a simple pastime. It's an addiction. And that trail that day was just the tall glass of rock vodka that I craved. I love the sturdiness of the cliffs, the gravel crunching under my climbing boots, and the crisp mountain air. A good climb always reminded me how alive I was. With the firm grip on my rope and the pick in my hand, I started scaling that vertical, rough, and fantastic mountain. I was on my usual finesse, mastering every nook and crevice, pushing myself. As I strained upwards, meticulously avoiding the treacherous loose rocks, the last thing on my mind was running into anything peculiar. Obviously, you expect some bird nests, a drop of sap from a pine tree, or, at worst, an unexpected gust of wind. You don't expect a face-to-face encounter with the more insane aspects of the natural world. But sometimes, you don't always get what you expect, do you? In retrospect, a part of me feels like I sensed it before I even saw anything. A certain heaviness in the air, an inexplicable shift in the atmosphere. The normal chirping sounds of the mountain had faded to a deafening silence. The quiet was so profound that I could hear my heart thumping against my ribcage. Suddenly, there was a weird, almost nauseating smell that overcame the wind carrying pine and fresh earth smell. It was a mishmash of wet dog, a faint scent of skunk, and something that smelled awfully like week-old garbage. The odor was so overpowering, it made me nauseous. I clung to that rock surface, trying not to retch. Then I heard it, the sound, a low growling rumble that echoed through the silence. A sound so strange and intense, it made the hairs on my nape stand up. Somewhere between an animal's howl and an eerie whooping noise that was far from any animal sound I'd ever heard. At this point, I wasn't just shocked or puzzled. I was downright terrified. It wasn't the fear of the immediate danger. It was the uncertainty that was freaking me out. I felt like a baby mouse being watched by an eagle circling miles above it. Invisible yet threatening. As I cautiously moved my eyes around, searching for the source of the sound, I suddenly saw it. Or at least I saw a part of it. Suffice it to say, my blood ran cold. Damn, I wish I could say it was just a bear, or even a rogue mountain lion. But it was neither. What I saw was giant. It was at least 7 feet tall and burly, a linebacker figure about 100 feet off to my right, on a flat ledge of the mountain. It was covered in hair like a grizzly, but redder and shining under that midday sun. And the smell, that rancid, gag-inducing odor, was undoubtedly wafting from it. The creature's profile was distinctly Neanderthal-like, with a cone-shaped head jutting out a little further than its massive chest, and its eyes were these beady, shiny little things, like dark, polished stones. Its face, though, that was the kicker. It didn't have hair on its face like the rest of its body, and despite the distance, I could make out a pronounced strong brow ridge, bridged nose, and thick lips. What rang in my ears next was a loud yelp-like sound that echoed off the granite cliffs, followed by a deep, throaty growl. It was almost primal. a menacing auditory warning that told me to stay right where I was. Time seemed to slow. I clung there, a third of the way up this massive wall, staring wide-eyed at this strange, hulking creature on the ledge. To my surprise, it didn't move. It just emitted another noise, a low rumble, which in hindsight could have been a call or a warning, I don't know. Swallowing hard, realization hit me. There was only one creature with these descriptions, the elusive Sasquatch. Hovering between fascination and stark terror, I made a split-second decision. Instead of scrambling upwards, I decided to awkwardly crab-walk my way horizontally across the massive rock face, putting some distance between me and the creature, hoping it wouldn't follow. Once I moved out of the creature's direct line of sight, I continued my climb at lightning speed. Every rustle of the wind, every bird's cry, seemed to amplify the fear coiling up in my gut. Even when I reached the top, my eyes darted back towards the ledge, but the Sasquatch, or whatever it was, had disappeared. Once I descended and safely got back to camp, I found everything as I had left it. No monstrous creature wreaking havoc or leaving gigantic footprints. I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. That night, I replayed the event over and over in my head. I wondered if what I'd seen was real or a fear-crafted illusion, but the hard claw of fear had paled in comparison to the exhilaration of journeying into the unknown and the astonishment of encountering a creature that storybooks and legends are made of, an actual Sasquatch. The belief that I had witnessed something rare and riveting had me eagerly wondering about the future. Climbing like the mountains offered a peculiar mix of brutal realism and dreamy escapism, and the experience just reminded me why I push myself to limits and scale mountains. It's not just for the thrill of standing atop a victory climb, or for the adrenaline high that you feel at 4,000 feet. It's also for these chance encounters that weave themselves into lifetime experiences that are worth sharing. I live in the beautiful city of Salem, Oregon. In my humble opinion, it's the absolute best place for people who love to dive headfirst into nature. Even our trails have a certain magic about them. So, as part of my daily ritual, and for the sheer love of it, I trail run with my four-legged partner in crime. His name is Rusty, and he is a border collie who's just as adventurous as I am, and that's saying something. I swear that dog was born to run. He's got this kind of wild spirit that makes you fall in love with him instantly. This story I'm going to share with you, it takes place on a crisp, sunny afternoon. Honestly, the weather was so perfect. It's one of those days you wish you could bottle up for later. The leaves covering the trail in a rustic toned blanket. Rusty and I started off at our usual pace, me trying to match his enthusiastic bounding with my steady jog. The rhythm of his yips and the crunch of leaves under my shoes were relaxing. It is during these runs that I feel truly connected with nature and everything around me. We were about halfway through our usual trail when Rusty's behavior began to change. This dog, who was always so full of life, seized up. His ears flattened against his skull, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. It wasn't the playful growl I'd come to associate with him spotting a squirrel or a rabbit. It was more fearing, protecting. Whatever it was, it set my nerves buzzing. I came to a halt, trying to catch what had alerted him. The trail was quiet, almost oppressively so, and I swear even the air smelled different, sickly sweet yet metallic, like the air in a room with too many electrical appliances. A whiff of something foul hit my nostrils, instantly making me wrinkle my nose, dread settling into my gut. It wasn't natural, or at the very least, it was a natural smell that had no business being out here, where the only scents were pine, earth, and sometimes Rusty's wet fur. Suddenly, as we stood there trying to figure out the rancid smell, a chilling howl echoed through the woods, sending a ripple of fear through my every nerve. I'd heard enough dog howls, and that hadn't been one. It sounded strange, guttural, and off. I was about to move, to pull Rusty back to the trail we'd come along, but the creature that appeared out of the bush was quicker. In my gut, I knew it wasn't a dog. It was too big, easily towering over us at 7 feet tall, with darting demonic eyes that looked far too intelligent. It was covered in dense, matted hair, so dark it was all I could do to make out its features. Its body was a jumbled mix. The bulkiness of the chest and the wide set of shoulders looked human, but its legs were all dog, capped off with overly large paws. It had a long snout carrying a double row of teeth that looked anything but friendly. A sharp, dangerous gleam accompanied those teeth and was the focal point of its grotesque face. The moment those eyes locked onto me, time seemed to slow. My heart pounded in my chest like a war drum, and I felt a chill run down my back. Rusty was still growling, the deadly seriousness in his canine voice reminding me how real this was. Desperate, I stumbled backwards, pulling Rusty with me, my mind frantically looping on the thought of escape. It growled, the sound piercing through the air as it lunged in our direction. However, we were quick on our feet and managed to put a good distance between us and the creature. Escaping from what I now began to realize was something far beyond my comprehension. Even once we had made it onto the main trail, with the terror of the encounter behind us, it didn't feel real. It felt like a horrible twist of nature, a fiercely primal predator pulled straight out of a chilling horror movie. The absurdity of what we saw was so profound, it was hard not to second-guess my own memory. In the days that followed, I was left with the echo of fear and a newfound respect for the unexpected. Comparing our usual, peaceful runs to the frightful experience, I was reminded just how swiftly tranquility could morph into terror. A walk in the wilderness was never going to be the same. Moreover, Rusty's reaction has had me marveling at the power of a dog's intuition. I was left with an insane amount of gratitude for my four-legged buddy. If it hadn't been for his initial warning signals, I don't know how things would have turned out. So, Donovan, that's my strange tale. I'm still coming to terms with how a run in the woods turned into a face-to-face encounter with a creature that I can only categorize as what cryptozoologists call a dogman. I'm not saying I'm a full-on believer now, but let's just say I've got a newfound respect for the mysteries of the world, and I don't take Rusty's warning signs lightly at all. Hey there, I thought I'd write in and share a tale that happened while I was out on a kayaking trip. Your show tends to deal with a lot of urban legends and strange happenings. And well, I reckon I've had an experience that fits the bill. I live in Springfield, Illinois, as run-of-the-mill a place as any, but every now and then, I get the itch to go off the beaten path. On this particular occasion, I decided to take a solo kayaking trip to one of the woodland rivers we have nearby. You can't really beat the peace and quiet of being out in nature, don't you think? The sun's just breaking through the trees as I set off on my kayaking trip. It's a beautiful day, truly. I got my supplies all packed, waterproofed the essentials, and went through the whole safety routine before I pushed off from the riverbank. My kayak glides through the water effortlessly, barely leaving a ripple in my wake. One of the best parts of these trips for me is the wildlife. The river cuts its way through the forest, and sometimes it feels like you're the only human around for miles. As I was paddling along, birds chirped above me in the canopy, and the sun cast long shadows on the forest floor. Further down the river, I spot a family of deer tentatively taking sips of water at the shore. I stay as quiet as I can, not wanting to startle them. I feel content, calm. Everything's as it should be. The first oddity strikes when I notice that the woodland noise has fallen eerily quiet, like someone's hit the mute button on the world. Didn't think much of it, figured maybe a predator was nearby, so I keep paddling, but it kept nagging at me. All of a sudden, a shiver runs down my spine. You know, that feeling you get when it seems like you're being watched. I stop my paddling, stay still, looking around, trying to figure out what's setting my instincts on high alert. And then, in the bleary after-sunset light, I see something unusual on the riverbank. I first notice a strange shape, tall, substantial, and shadowy. I squint, try to make sense of what I'm seeing. Whatever it was, it didn't belong in this world. It was neither human nor animal, like a silhouette that didn't fit into this tranquil landscape. Now, if this were a fishing story, I'd probably be talking about some giant fish. But out there on that peaceful river, that's where this unidentifiable creature made its entrance. But that's a tale for another time. To be honest, I've been doing very much like what most of us do when things get weird. I keep it to myself, put it at the back of my mind and try to keep moving. But now, maybe it's time to share. I mean, weird stuff happens all the time, right? Sometimes there aren't any explanations, and this, my friend, is one of those times. So, I was right in the middle of the river. It had started to darken now, sunset blazing in the skies above. I've seen a lot of wildlife in these parts, but whatever I saw that evening, it didn't seem quite right. You've probably had moments like these, where things appear strange or out of place. And there it was, this disproportionately tall figure standing on the bank. It was too distant to make out clearly, but there was something bat-like about it. It appeared to be standing on two legs, but was taller than any critter I've ever seen around here. The edges of its body seemed to flutter subtly with the evening breeze, hinting at what looked like wings, and it didn't move from its post for a good few minutes. In retrospect, I couldn't understand why I didn't take out my camera. Noticing it fully wasn't the problem. It was understanding what I was seeing that was harder. I wasn't sure if it was the fading light playing tricks on my eyes, or if there really was something there. The boat wobbled under me as I reached for my binoculars without taking my eyes off the figure. The sight that greeted me through the lenses was unexplainable. The figure was closer now, almost human, like with a body about 6 feet tall. What I mistook as fluttering fabric were large leathery type wings folded behind it. But what really threw me out of the loop were its eyes. They were reflective, large red eyes, almost glowing in the deep of the evening. Without thinking, my hand slipped and the binoculars plunged into the water with a splash. The creature looked at me then, releasing an almost unnoticeably soft chirr before it disappeared into the thicket. My mind was racing. I was swept up in a mixture of fear and bewilderment. My arms ached from the sudden jerk of the paddle as I fervently rowed away. The serene river from the afternoon was now poisoned by the eerie encounter. I tried to make it back to the point where I left my car, while the remnants of the day's light were on my side. Halfway there, I considered dumping the kayak and swimming back, but somehow I made it back. Since then, my perspective on nature has undoubtedly changed. It's not just a place of tranquility anymore, but a realm of unanswered questions, a domain where the unexpected thrives. That figure is still etched in my memory. Was it a trick of the shadows that my tired mind fell for? Or was it something unfamiliar that my brain tried hard to label? I often found myself wrestling with these questions. Sometimes we can be so taken in by the rhythm of our mundane lives that we forget the vast expanse of the unknown that still exists out there. I'm sure this story might fuel some fascination in your show's followers. The world is full of unexplainable phenomena, and to be honest, encountering one myself has only sparked my curiosity rather than deterring me from my adventures. Thanks for listening, and if any of your listeners have any similar stories to share, I'd love to hear them.